It's now my pleasure to get this underway. I would like to introduce you to Margaret Tutwiler. She's our Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs.
Thank you very much. I have some really lovely prepared remarks that I know somebody spent a lot of time on, but I decided that I am not going to speak from those because I'd rather speak from experience and from the heart, and to tell you most sincerely the importance of arts and embassies, not only to an ambassador's residence, but for what it actually does overseas for our country. These are very troubled and difficult times that we're all living in as Americans. And I can tell you that through art that you give to us or art that you produce for us, that it is a connect that's on a level that has nothing to do with policies. One of the things that I have been advocating based on experience since returning is that there is an appropriate place and part of our job in the public sector for the articulation, enunciation, and defense of our government's policies. But we're more than just policy as Americans. And we are our culture, and we are our art. And I have been encouraging my colleagues in the government to recognize, as more and more I think people do, what I refer to, and a man named Mr. Joseph Nye at Harvard does, soft power. And to some of you that may be offensive and a turnoff, but it actually is something that I think for us as Americans culturally translates very well. And for too long, I think that government officials, myself included when I've served before, did not really appreciate or recognize the real value to our country of programs such as Arts and Embassies. And I am here today because my good friend Ann Johnson asked me to, but I'm also here because I know that it matters. And I have recently spent 2 years of my life living in a country of 31 million Muslims and Arabs. And I know that the art that was in the residence, not my residence, but in the residence, mattered. And it was warm, and it was pretty, and it was different, and it was diversified. And even when we were having contentious policy debates, which we had all the time in that residence, I knew that I was surrounded by an America that was more than our policies, and an America that really, really and truly mattered. And I would like to also point out that you've got a distinguished panel here today, but you've also got one gentleman who is taking it beyond just acting, but participating, and that is Mr. Michael Kaiser. And he participates in a program that the Bush administration initiated called Cultural Ambassadors. And I know that I can speak for all of us in this department that we are deeply appreciative of the non-free time that he has, that he goes beyond in helping our country overseas. I'd also like to point out one other thing that I learned about when I returned to Washington approximately a year ago, was that Ann Johnson knew the value of artists, and we've taken it a step further. And I believe you identified 13 to 16 artists who actually went out into countries overseas and connected on a craft. And the craft was art, and it was extremely successful. We are trying to encourage more artists to do it. And we have actually, in fact, created, since I have been here, something I refer to as citizen diplomats. And that is normal Americans, whether they be artists, firemen, policemen, engineers, bankers, that they go to a country for us and they connect based on their craft, based on their profession. So we do not have to have all Americans overseas just engaging on policy. And we have started this new program, and so far it has been very successful. And it is again a way, in the environment we all find ourselves in, it is a way to listen, to engage, and to participate with people who do not live in our country. And it is very, very important that everyone overseas, especially in the Muslim and Arab world, have a more accurate understanding and appreciation, hopefully respect of who we really are. We are not a cartoon, and we are not Baywatch, and we are not Dallas, which is regrettably the #1 show watched throughout the region. And so what you do most sincerely really, really matters, and I know that every ambassador overseas and every officer who's serving overseas would tell you the same thing and would appreciate so much what all of you all are doing. And I apologize. Ann knows and let me off the hook that I cannot stay for the panel discussion. Excuse me, I would sincerely like to, but I have a scheduling conflict, and so I appreciate this brief moment that Ann afforded me to thank you all and to tell you with sincere appreciation what the Arts and Embassies program meant in the post I served in and in all the other 223 posts around the world. So have a very good conference, and thank you for letting me take a little bit of your time. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Ellen McCulloch-Lovell. I'm most recently president of the Center for Arts and Culture and director of the Veterans History Project at the American Folklife Center, and am returning from Washington after my first 5 weeks as president of Marlborough College in southeastern Vermont. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I wanted to begin by saying I think it is absolutely critical that this conversation is happening today in this room at the U.S. Department of State. And I want to thank the Undersecretary and Ann Johnson for initiating this very, very important conversation. Call it winning hearts and minds, soft power, cultural diplomacy. We're here today not only to celebrate 40 years of accomplishment in the Arts and Embassies program, but also more broadly to look at the role of arts and culture in conveying the creativity and freedoms of the United States and in building long-term understanding among people. How can we have an authentic international conversation? As Nobel laureate author Wole Soyinka said, politics polarizes, art humanizes. That's what we're going to talk about today, including as many of you as we can. We're going to begin with a very distinguished panel. And first, I'd like to tell you a little bit about how we're going to have this conversation. I'm going to be directing a question to each panelist. They're going to answer that question, and I'm going to invite the other panelists to comment. When we finish that round, I might throw some more questions at you and have a conversation with the panelists trying to bring out their expertise. And then we're going to move to you, and we'll invite your questions and your comments from the floor. Just remember that other people want to comment, so if you start making a speech, I'll probably cut you off as politely as I can. And there are two microphones at the back. And it's very important if you will go to the microphone, say your name, any affiliation, and ask your question so that this can all be part of the written document. I also really want to thank Elizabeth Ash for all the arrangements that she made to pull this great panel together. And I want to compliment Marcia Mayo and Sally Mansfield, the editors of the very fine book that you're going to see soon, or you may have in your hands, and then we'll ask for applause, Andrew Solomon, for a really important essay that will become part of the written documentation of what is a field and should be recognized as a field. So let's thank them for their good work. I also want to thank the Center for Arts and Culture for their co-sponsorship of this, and acknowledge Frank Hodsell, the president, who's sitting in the audience, along with distinguished trustees and staff members of the Center for Arts and Culture. Now, I believe you all have the bios, but just to get us oriented to the expertise that's on our panel, I'll make a few introductions to the panelists. I'm going to do it in alphabetical order, but then I'm going to mix it up when I ask them questions. Charles Coles is the founder and president of his own gallery, which is in Chelsea in New York City. And he is a trustee of a number of public arts agencies and a trustee of very important nonprofit cultural organizations, including the Museum of Modern Art. And for over a decade, he was affiliated with Art Forum.
I have to correct you on one thing. I'm not a trustee of the Museum of Art. I'm on one of the trustee committees. It's a conflict of interest for me to be a trustee. That's
All
okay.
right, thank you for clarifying that. No one will believe that you have a conflict of interest. Carl Hoffman has assumed his duties as Special Assistant to the Secretary and Executive Secretary to the Department of State in 2002, but before that he spent 2 years as Ambassador to the Republic of Togo, and there hosted an artist, and we're going to hear more about that. He is one of that wonderful breed of career Foreign Service officers who's held a variety of positions at Department of State and also served on the NSC at the White House. Michael Kaiser, president of the JFK Center for the Performing Arts, and of course Michael oversees all the artistic programming, the fiscal health, which I know includes fundraising, Michael, of the Kennedy Center, and is really helping it to assume its rightful role as our national performing arts center. And as the Undersecretary mentioned, he is our cultural ambassador from the U.S. Department of State, and will be commenting broadly on that role and what he's observed in some of his many activities. Adair Margot, fourth-generation Texan, has observed cultural exchange across borders firsthand. She was also appointed by President Bush as the chair of the President's Committee on the Arts and the Humanities, and has been participating directly with the U.S.-Mexico Fund for Culture. Adair's also a gallery owner, and so she has that perspective on the Arts and Embassies program, as well as a broad perspective on cultural diplomacy. Thurman Statham, our artist, renowned artist, known for his multimedia work, and you'll see some beautiful illustrations in the book with public installations and exhibitions all over the country. And I've been struck not only at how widely you've exhibited, but also your personal devotion to arts education and to introducing youth to arts. And I know we'll hear more about that when we hear about your experience as an artist in residence abroad. He's also been the recipient of several National Endowment for the Arts awards, and is as an artist, is a lender to the Arts and Embassies program. So we're going to begin with the first question, and I'm going to address it to Adair. I really want to start today with the big frame. You chair the President's Committee. This year you accompanied Mrs. Bush to the re-entry of the United States into UNESCO, very important development for culture. Would you address really what is the importance of cultural diplomacy programs, such as Art and Embassies and others, and how can we best use arts and culture to convey U.S. values and democracy abroad?
I remember when I went with Mrs. Bush to the United States re-entry into UNESCO, and Jim Billington was on our plane, and he made a comment that I haven't forgotten. He says, you know, we really need to get better about communicating all of the United States to all of the world. And I think Art and Embassies, of course, from El Paso, Texas, sometimes I believe we need to get better at communicating all of the United States to all of the United States. Because we are so rich and we're so diverse and we have so many different perspectives. And in fact, just being upstairs in the Ben Franklin room with Bruce Nauman, I mean, these neon poking their eyes out, you know, poking their fingers at each other, and then much more subtle works. I mean, somehow they all fit in that environment. And that's what I think Art and Embassies has done so well, is to cast a really broad net. Being from El Paso, where I am a Texan, but barely, you know, you lose balance and you're in Mexico or New Mexico. But we've always participated in Art in Embassy. So they cast a broad net, I think, for these various voices from across the United States, and then share that with the world through our embassies, which is really, I think, a brilliant strategy. When you talk about, I wanted to just share one example because I think you asked me, how do we better use artists to promote U.S. values? And I just got back from, I'm going to use a performing arts example because it's been on my mind since being in Mexico City about a month ago with my husband, where Wynton Marsalis was playing. And he is a performing artist, but I know many of you, I visited with you this morning at a reception, the artists, that you have stories you can share. I know you're doing the very same thing. But in watching Wynton Marsalis and those marvelous jazz musicians perform, not only did they perform for huge audiences, but then they went and jammed with jazz clubs, like till 3 in the morning. And then they get up in the morning at 7 o'clock and go do a children's concert. And I started thinking, how do they do that? How do they have that stamina? And I realized it was because they were sharing what they loved. They were sharing what they loved with people who really loved it too. And that's how they didn't run out of energy. And when Wynton Marsalis, when he talked about what they were doing in jamming, he talked about how in jazz, each instrument has a lot of ego to it, because you can make a horn sound like your horn. You make your drums sound like your drums. So there's a lot of ego to it, but there's also a lot of respect for the other players, because they have their own sound too. And that's what America's about. I mean, that's why I think Art in Embassies, it's not in a preachy kind of way, but just by sharing that, I think it communicates what this country's all about.
Thank you, Adair. I'm going to ask Carl to pick up on Adair's comments and maybe take them a little farther about the significance of using arts and culture. And maybe you could also address something that the Undersecretary brought up. You know, other countries have really deep policy differences with us right now. Can culture overcome that?
Thank you, Ellen. Before I start, I would say, just as I'm not an artist, I'm not a gallery owner, but I suppose I could call myself a practitioner of cultural diplomacy when I was abroad. And I want to say on behalf of my wife and myself to all of you who are artists and all of you who have participated in the program, how honored we are, and I know I speak for every American ambassador when I say this, how honored we are to be the temporary custodians of your creative work. This is a very powerful tool you give us. It's a tremendously powerful tool that you give us that we can put in our toolbox and use in our efforts to engage peoples around the world across the spectrum of human interaction. And I want you to know that we're very honored that you allow us to do that. You know, Adair was talking about jazz just now. And of course, I have spent a lot of my career in Africa, most recently in Togo in West Africa. And jazz, of course, is in many ways inseparable from the African-American experience. And I wonder if we could, you can't even conceive of disaggregating Africa from American culture today. So we were able to see in Africa how we could use art, whether it was the medium of photographs that Ann Meredith loaned us, or paintings that Karen Gunderson loaned us, or jazz musicians who visited us as well. We were able to point out that there are these connections that transcend policy differences. And as ambassadors abroad, as Margaret Tutwiler said, are always trying to promote American interests and safeguard American values, we're always trying to find a way to, while we forcefully advocate for American policies, to convey that there are many other ways in which we connect and to build support for what we're trying to do. And And art and music were a very effective way of doing that. One particular point I would make in the Togo context, Togo, like many parts of Africa, suffers from a serious HIV/AIDS problem. And there's a great stigma attached to it. Hard to break through that stigma. The government denied the existence of the problem. People were not willing to deal with those who were HIV positive in a positive way and allow them to continue to contribute to society, as we know they can. And we used the photographs that Anne lent us of HIV-positive Americans, big blown up photographs that were in our residence, to provoke discussions around this and to make it clear that this was something we were grappling with, and yes, you were grappling with it too in Togo. And it was a very powerful message that we were able to deploy in support of what we were trying to do.
Thanks, Carl. How about others of you on the broader question of cultural diplomacy? Is it important? How do we practice it? How can it be better?
I think it's extremely important. My first exposure was through the Museum of Modern Art. In the 50s, under Nelson Rockefeller, the museum started a big program called the International Council, and they chose people from around the world, primarily people who were museum trustees around the world, to become affiliated with the Museum of Modern Art, so that when the museum sent a show overseas, it would be better received in that country and they could smooth the way through the government problems and things like that. And then, of course, brought those people in as patrons of the museum. There were a lot of left-wing people who criticized the museum for using art as a tool for diplomacy, but I think it was a great tool, quite truthfully.
Well, you're bringing in the role of other cultural institutions outside of government, and
Well, this actually,
we're going to come back to that.
this sort of preceded this idea of art and embassies, I think.
That's right. It was
Yeah.
a precursor,
Yeah.
wasn't it? Michael, or do you want to comment on Adair's descriptions? No, not yet. Thurman?
You know, I think about it on a, I mean, it's obviously very, very important, and I relate to the diplomacy issue on a very one-on-one basis as an artist working, and with people. And I found that in Mozambique, it was just very, it opened doors, I think, to different sort of sectors and within that area. And as a vehicle, I think there's potential. I mean, there were so many outlets opened up through it that I feel very positive about that.
Speaking of the artist experience, I'm going to jump back to Carl again to just tell us a little bit more about what happened when you were ambassador and Karen Gunderson came as part of the American Artists Abroad program. Maybe you want to describe what that is and tell us what happened, and did it surprise you? Was it what you thought was going to happen? Did you reach the audience that you hoped to reach in that residency?
Well, I think so, but Karen's right here, and we should probably ask her to speak at some point. I'll tell you about my perspective on it. Karen Gunderson joined us in Togo in the summer of 2002, I believe. And from our perspective in the embassy, had a fantastic program. I mean, a program with fantastic impact. She worked with some local artists. She got into some practical discussions with them, helped organize a show. And the best thing about it, the best of all, is that she has maintained contact with them and is still working now through our embassy there to try and help them further develop their talents, and hopes to be able to help them show some of their work here in the United States. And I think that's a great example of how, as someone was saying earlier, this, the artistic experience is really a conversation. I mean, this is, so much of what we were presenting was clearly influenced by some of the things coming out of Africa, in our case, other influences around the world. It was a two-way street. So from those 2 weeks in Togo, I think Karen laid an important sort of foundation for lasting cultural communication that I hope is going to blossom further. We found it a really positive experience.
Karen, are you near a microphone? Where are you?
Go ahead, stand up and say a few words.
Yeah,
about
I
it.
think,
Sorry.
I think we should hear from the artist.
I'm sorry to do this
Yeah.
to you. I'm sorry
Yeah.
to do this to you.
Let's hear directly from you what your experience was, and what did you think? What was the conversation that you were having people to people there?
During the workshop itself with the young artists, I tried to talk to them about women in art. At one point, there was a young man who was doing kind of generic-looking African women, and I took him to task for it, and we had kind of an argument. My French wasn't very good, and his English wasn't very good, but we had a good talk. And ultimately, he ended up sending me a great image of a woman. What I said to him was, your mother, you would care about what your mother looks like, you would care about your sister. These are individuals. Every African woman doesn't look the same. And so then he ended up sending me some other images to show me he could do it, kind of thing. But they were very talented and very resourceful, and they had such a joy about things and such a kind of respect that when I left Togo, I left understanding that when I think about Africa, it's a much different place than I thought of. Because before I would think about it being poor people in trouble. Yes, that's true, but there's a real spirit there of people that I really care about and I hope to help. And that's basically what it gave me, and I really am grateful for it.
Did it
Thank you.
change you and your art to be there?
Oh, I'm so stubborn as an artist, I'm not sure if it did or not. If it did, it's going to sink in over time. Not directly in that.
Could you tell us just a little bit more about what Carl mentioned, which is the ongoing relationship that you've had since you left with the artists?
Well, we have been emailing. I decided that an important thing to do would be to have an exhibition of this group that I got close to when I was there. There were about 8 of them. The workshop itself was about 16 people, I think, and about 8 of them connected. We connected like, just people do. And I wanted to be sure that there were women in the group as well. So I kind of singled out 3 of the women. And so we've got about 5 guys and 3 women. And we're writing each other via email, and they're sending me images of their work. And I have kind of culled from their work what I think are the best images and made a CD. And I've started a letter, and I'm going to be sending this to different colleges and universities, galleries throughout the United States, and try to get them a group show, because I really feel that, we kind of export our culture, via so many different articles into the world. And isn't it a great thing to have them come to us and gain from them? So and we've been having this really nice dialogue.
Thank you, Karen. You've opened up another really important subject I'm hoping Michael Kaiser will address.
Good.
Now, Michael, you're cultural ambassador. You've been active in facilitating cultural exchange, including the recent visit of the Iraqi orchestra to the Kennedy Center. And you've mentioned how cultural diplomacy is a two-way street. And I know you're working on a new international capacity building program. So tell us about that.
Sure. I have to start by saying that I work in the performing arts, not the visual arts, so I feel a little bit like the odd man out today. But there is one major difference between the performing arts and much of the visual arts world, which is that the performing arts is ephemeral. You give a performance and it's gone, whereas for many of you who work in the visual arts, you create something and it has lasting value. So this image, this concern of creating something that lasts is very, very important to me. And as I was working and discussing with the State Department the whole concept of cultural ambassadors, I really was concerned with the notion of someone going off to another country, singing a concert and leaving, and was concerned about what lasting impact do we really have. I was also concerned that for many people in many countries, they feel they get enough American culture. It might be popular culture, but there's a concern of how do we do something that supports their culture and really creates an exchange. Third factor is that much of the world is changing, and particularly the way the arts and the performing arts are supported throughout much of the world is changing. We in this country have never really enjoyed very much government support or central government support, but in most of the world, that's how the performing arts have been funded. And yet most central governments are cutting back rather substantially on the way they support their arts organizations. So with all of that in mind, I created a program to help to take American expertise in how do you work entrepreneurially to create support for your arts organizations, and how might you work with arts organizations around the world to support local culture. So rather than exporting American culture, what we're exporting is American expertise. The first country we've worked on is Mexico. We've been working there now for almost a year and will continue now. And we're actually having, I think, quite an important impact. In Mexico, about 90% of the funding for the arts for government-supported organizations, which is most of the performing arts organizations, 90% of their funding comes from the government. The government is cutting back very substantially, and the arts organizations are left without any knowledge of where to go for funds. Complicating matters in Mexico is if you, for example, sell more tickets than you were budgeted to, you have to give all the money back to the government. So if you are, there's very little encouragement to be an entrepreneur in the arts, and if you're running a ballet company or a symphony or an opera company, you really can't build a larger base than the government's willing to give you. So we've been working to, on the one hand, train Mexican arts organizations how to become more entrepreneurial, and on the other hand, working with the Mexican government through their central funding agency called Conaculta to change the laws for the way arts organizations function. And I think we're going to have a fairly substantial impact on that country over the next several years. Right now, we're working with a test group of 25 arts organizations who now have all new rules for funding and who have the right to raise money and the right to sell tickets and the right to do subscriptions and the right to become a little bit more self-sufficient. And I think if those 25 organizations prosper, and I think they will, then we will really change the entire way performing arts organizations in Mexico are funded. To me, this is a wonderful way for us to be exporting our expertise. We're getting better press in Mexico for this project than for virtually anything else having to do with America at the moment. And it's something that I'm very excited about working on with other countries as well, although we'll continue with Mexico for a couple of years, but we're in discussions with South Africa, and we're in discussions with China and with several other countries about how we can use this kind of project to change the arts landscape and really contribute as Americans to the cultural landscape of foreign countries.
Michael, are you, when you're exporting arts administration expertise, are you using the expertise of the Kennedy Center per se, or are you drawing on some other cultural institutions? And conversely, do the Mexican arts administrators come here? Is it an exchange?
Right now, the project is run through the Kennedy Center. That will change as we add countries, so it will be much broader than the Kennedy Center. There's an exchange now with respect to artists. We have an ongoing festival called Americartes at the Kennedy Center, which includes artists from Mexico. It's a look at Latin American art, and a whole contingent of Mexican artists have been to the Kennedy Center as part of this. In terms of bringing their arts managers to the Kennedy Center, we can bring very few into a program we have, which is an arts management training institute at the Kennedy Center. In fact, our first Mexican participant will be here this September. But the majority of the work is done with myself and my staff in Mexico, and then we're using technology, computer technology. We have web chats and discussions on a regular basis with the arts leaders in Mexico.
Mm-hmm. You also mentioned cultural ambassadors, which is a program of the Department of State. Does everybody know what cultural ambassadors are? Okay, I didn't think so. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Surely. The State Department has created a program called Culture Connect, which has several different kinds of artists, and presently I think it's mostly performing artists, working to go abroad and to represent themselves and their country as they work abroad. Denise Graves, the great American opera singer, is a cultural ambassador. Yo-Yo Ma, the great American cellist, is a cultural ambassador. Frank McCourt, who's a writer, is a cultural ambassador. There are several different people participating in this program. Each of us gets to create our own project, and for me, the project that I've mentioned in Mexico is what made sense for me to do.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Adair, I wondered if you wanted to pick up on that because you've had so much experience in Mexico yourself and whether this is a kind of a best practice or model program you could see the U.S. taking to countries.
The Kennedy Centers? Yeah, I think it's a wonderful idea. One thing that, you know, with Mexico, we are so decentralized, as I've, you know, communicated. We're so diverse and connecting all these various states, or a country who's used to dealing with the Ministry of Culture with all these various states and helping them navigate connections. It's all about, you know, connecting artists and connecting organizations. But I've heard a lot about Kennedy Center. Did you want to know what we're doing with the President's Committee?
I was trying to give you the opening.
Well, one of our areas when we were asked what we would like to do with this committee, which is a very nimble committee without a lot of resources, although we can bring private resources to the table. One was international relations, beginning with Mexico. And as our closest neighbor, and since I'm from the border and have known Mexico for a long time, friends in Mexico. But what we had a meeting, actually, just getting together has a lot, can affect, I think, a lot of change. Our committee, one of our first meetings, we had wanted to go to Mexico but could not meet outside of the country, and so really just convened the cultural organizations from Mexico and the United States, the NEA, the NEH, IMLS, in Santa Fe, which is the northern capital of the old Camino Real, the Royal Road. So there was this history of connections between Mexico and the United States. And just that convening, being able to convene people, call them together, help things begin to formulate. You know, the Maya exhibit was just opened here, which was in the works. Rusty Powell joined us there in Santa Fe. But by all the right players being there, the Diego Rivera exhibition happened there at that meeting. And every time we meet, we now even the projects that we go about this, we do awards once a year here in Washington recognizing U.S. programs. We have invited Mexico to recognize some of their programs. So again, it's about pulling people together, I think, so often. In fact, one time I was speaking to the White House personnel, and someone said, well, your legacy with this committee, what would you want it to be? What do you want to see? And I really think it's all about relationships. It's hoping that when the administration's gone, when I'm gone, when various people are gone, that enough people will have come together and gotten to know each other, and to know, as the artist who was in Africa, who said, I realize they're not like that, because I know so-and-so, or I know so-and-so. It's bringing them together enough so that when you have policy disagreements or yelling, ranting, and raving about all these things, that all of us can say, they're not like that because I know so-and-so.
Overcoming what Elie Wiesel might call the other.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
What about some of the others of you on the subject of building capacity of cultural institutions abroad, or the exchange of arts administrators as cultural diplomacy and cultural exchange? Anybody want to comment on that? No, not in particular. We'll come back to that. All right, I'm going to turn to Thurman because I think it's time to hear from an artist again. And I know that you participated in the American Artist Abroad program in Mozambique. So why don't you share some of your experience about that? And I think you might want to show some images too.
Okay, that's fine. Why don't you start? You can start with one of the images now. Let me think. Mozambique. Let me think. I was, the ambassador had 3 of my pieces, and I remember when I first got involved with Mozambique, or actually the Arts and Embassies program, I was so surprised. I was like, why would they want one of my pieces? My dealer calls me up and says they want some of my work, and I'm like, what? what country is this? I'm thinking, you know. Well, I'm thinking, well, then my next thought is, can I stay at their house, you know? That's what I'm thinking, you know. You think I could stay at the embassy? And then I'm going, well, you know, the government wants some of my work? Well, anything with art and the government, I'm a player for. That's a good idea, you know, the arts and the government, that's good. Maybe it can lead to something. And then after about 6 years, lo and behold, I get a call, and they want me to come to Mozambique. So I did about 12 workshops. I says, let's do a lot of things. Let's do something every day, something different. And the embassy formatted me. They basically set up different formats. The workshops varied from 9 children to over 240 children in a workshop. They were totally. After each workshop, I died and went to heaven. I mean, I
You
think
did.
I did. They were just so incredibly what I learned. The content of each workshop was, you can just go through them to the next one. The content of the workshops varied tremendously. At one point I was with these artists, and we were looking at each other, and I says, why are you here for? What are you doing here for? And they said, well, we came because they have these big meals, you know? And I went, and they didn't know you were going to be. I said, what are we going to talk about? So we went, well, let's talk about money. All of a sudden, everyone was real interested in me. And we addressed just survival techniques. You know, we addressed gallery structures. You know, what do they sell? The next thing you know, we're talking about tourist artwork as opposed to traditional sculpture. You know, each one varied quite. This group here is a group of local artists from Maputo. And I'd say half of them were better than me. I ended up being the teacher. I mean, they ended up teaching me about what to make. And we basically worked for 3 days, and we collaborated. Anyone could work on anyone's artwork. And we ended up doing installations. They wanted to learn how to work in glass. And I went, what do you want to work in glass for? And then the next thing you know, they were making my pieces better than myself, you know. And so we exchanged technical stuff. We talked about, at one point we were at an internet cafe looking at the value of their work in the States as opposed to that, and setting up systems for how do they communicate with me, you know, how could they sell their work, you know, just things like this. So they varied quite a bit. You know, some of the workshops were incredibly rural, you know, where people didn't even have paper at one point. And one workshop there were so many participants that I lost count, over 240. And we had to they wanted to paint. Everyone wanted to paint. So I went, oh my God, what do, you know? So we made brushes out of wood. We just used the trees. And at one point I was doing yoga exercises and as sources of inspiration. And then we did dances, and then we had exhibitions. And it was just really, really fantastic, you know.
Sounds like you were there for a year.
Well, you know, every day I went with the intent of taking a second trip. So it was sort of like a field trip inside. And so we scheduled from the first day on, every day, something. And, you know, at one point we did a TV show, you know, with kids. And that was hysterical because I made them all work blindfolded, you know, which was really fantastic.
Why did you do that?
You know, this is actually a shot during that time. Part of actually I had to contend with the announcer person that worked there, and she was so controlling that when the kids couldn't see what she was doing, we were able to do something interesting, you know.
Uh-huh.
You know, and
I knew there was an interesting answer to that question.
It was to keep the announcer under control.
Uh-huh.
But each situation, you know, there was, you know, the diplomatic corps was amazing. They at many times, you know, I made them take off their hats and become workshop sort of organizers and participants, particularly with a lot of people. And they basically formatted me to do whatever I wanted with the group. They
didn't tell you what to do.
They didn't
as an
tell me
artist
what
in
to
residence.
do. Exactly. And I was constantly going, what do you want me to do? What do you expect out of me? And from it, you know, I stay in touch in a very ethereal way with all the different people. You know, the follow-up is difficult because I have trouble with names. So I was talking to a guy for about an hour a month ago. He calls me collect, and it took me a half hour to figure out who he was, you know? And so I have their art. I put the art they gave me up, and I use that to identify people. I go, which painting did you give me? He says, oh, that, okay, yeah, now I remember, you know? And, you know, the potential is just unbelievable.
Thurman,
know?
how do you think their views of the United States changed? Did they change, or was it their view of you that changed
I think,
as an individual American?
you know, I think that depending on the region, in the city, I think their view of me and of America changed a lot because I think they looked at it as more of a resource and a venue, at least this country, as a venue for actually being able to make better work and surviving. You know, I think in Maputo and Mozambique, that's relevant in the sense that a lot of the artists I discovered, you know, when they went independent in '75, they were socialistic, and a lot of the artists when they became a democracy in '75, a lot of the artists never realized that. You know, that they could actually increase the value of the work. You know, and that's one point that came out of it. But I think it was a combination of me and you know, I think that the fabric, I feel that as an artist, the fabric of what goes on in these workshops is really sort of a foundation, you know, for a lot of the activities that happen. You know, I actually hear from a lot of performing artists too, oddly enough, and you know, I see it's amazing because one of the most amazing things that's exciting for me is the potential of this kind of programming, particularly, you know, because there's an embassy in every country, but anyway.
Yeah, Michael, dive in.
Yeah, again, from the performing arts perspective, I think what Thurman said, which is so important, is that you never really know what's going to come out of these workshops. You can't program it. It's not as specific that you can say, we're going to go here and do this, and this is going to be the outcome. The most memorable trip I ever took, I used to run the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater, an African-American organization, and we went to Israel. And the learning that went on both sides was really quite astonishing. Both what our audiences learned, but also what my dancers learned, what my crew learned, what I learned in that interchange. We could never have predicted that going in, but we knew it would be exciting and we knew it would be important, and it was really important. And that, I think, is one of the great important values of arts exchange, is it's not, you don't know how you're going to influence people's lives, but you know you are going to influence people's lives. And all the travels I did with the Alvin Ailey Company, really the extraordinary amount I learned, that my dancers learned, and that the countries learned, we could not have programmed it. It's not why we went. We went because we were paid a fee to go, but boy, was it important that we went.
And Michael, when you went with Alvin Ailey, or recently in this Mexican capacity building project, do you think that the people in other countries changed their minds about the United States, or about individual Americans, or about American art, or, you know?
I don't think it's as simple as saying you go, you do a performance, and everyone thinks about you differently. I believe the same way I believe that you don't expose a child once to art and all of a sudden they want to become artists. I believe it's a question of something habitual. If we habitually allow people to see a different part of ourselves and to see who we are and to see the diversity of who we are, we influence the way we are perceived. But I don't believe it's a one-time occurrence. I don't believe you go and do a performance and all of a sudden someone thinks about you differently. I think they see another side of you, and then another side of you, and another side of you, and they start to appreciate you as a whole person. I should say it's true in reverse. When we start to see people from other countries and we see the art they produce, and we start to see the many different sides of their work, we all of a sudden understand them in a different way as well. So I believe it has to do with volume and with different perspectives and different kinds of art. I don't think it's as simple as saying, send over a piece of art and we'll change the world.
And maybe it has to do with persistence.
Absolutely.
Carl, how about your experience of that? And also, What was it like to have an artist make you take your hat off or your
Well, it's
suit
hard. It's,
as a diplomat?
We don't like to roll up our sleeves, so it's hard. It was an accomplishment. Picking up on what Michael just said, I think he's absolutely right. Of course, you don't have one interaction and change the way the other thinks of you, and that ideally we do this as an accretion, that you're constantly adding to this, constantly expanding the way others think of us, and hopefully in a positive way. That's the ideal. Of course, we know that there are resource constraints. We can't do this as often as we want. We don't do it as extensively as we want. None of us, I think, is happy with the level to which we're able to do this sort of thing. And of course, the converse is true. There are large, certainly not in Israel or in Europe or in many parts of the developed world, but in the developing world, there may be large groups of people who do form their opinion of the United States, not from Baywatch because they don't look at a television, they don't have access to electricity, but from the human interaction they have with one American, which could be a Peace Corps volunteer, or it could be an artist coming through, or it's an American diplomat, or whatever. And that's a challenge. I think, we believe, I think this is our optimistic side, we all believe that if given more time and more interaction, we can always transcend differences and make the other understand just as we understand the other better. But it's a challenge to do that when we don't have the opportunity to interact as often as we want. We don't have the ability to put people out there and to fertilize one another culturally. And damage can be done, obviously, to the image of the United States based on individual interactions that sometimes form a lasting impression. And that's a challenge.
Did you want to comment?
And then more interactions can count. I mean, it's human life. I mean, it's what you said to me. I mean, how we misunderstand each other, or one interaction might not be good, but then that's why it's important to have so much of this going on, especially choosing people who really want to share what they love. I think that there you cannot go wrong when you really have people who want to share what they love with other people who love the same thing. But they're inspired by their culture, by their textiles or whatever. And and it's never a giving and a taking or a preaching and a receiving, but it's this constant energy of sharing.
That's right.
I'm going to get Charles in on this from the gallery owner point of view.
From a gallery owner point of view, I moved my gallery about 3 years ago to Chelsea, and it's a very remote location in Manhattan. The only people who come there are people who want to look at art. We get 2,000 to 3,000 visitors on a typical Saturday in the gallery, and I would say that 25% of them are from overseas. And they're there because they want to look at art, they want to see what's going on. They also want to tell us what they're up to, what they've seen, what they're doing, things like that. We get a lot of people coming, obviously, who are artists who want us to look at their work, which we try to do, but we can't very well accommodate them all because we only represent 20 people. But we also work with our artists. We help place them in galleries overseas. We place them with collectors overseas. We do exhibitions overseas, like next year, not next year, at the end of this year, November, I'm doing the Paris photo exhibition and taking with me the artists that I represent who do photographic work. And that's a way of sort of taking the works overseas and showing them and things like that. We, of course, work with ambassadors that are brought to us by the Art and Embassies program, and we lend regularly, if we can, to various embassies, not necessarily for sales, although I have had a few sales that way, not many. But I think it's really important that we get this interchange going back and forth.
Well, you mentioned you didn't get sales from participating by being a lender. Why are you a lender? Why are you so involved in
Because I think it's
the
good for
visual
the
arts
artists'
exchange?
works to be seen overseas. I think it's good for the embassies to feel more human. I think it adds a certain, quality of life for the people who are visiting the embassy as well as the embassy, the people who live in the embassy. I think it's really important, though, for the artists to have their work exposed overseas, and for the people overseas to see there's something else going on in the world other than what they know at home.
Well, a couple of you, thank you. Carl?
Well, I was just going to add on the point of trying to make us more human abroad. That can't be overlooked. All of you who visited an American embassy abroad know the rigors of security under which we have to live now. And despite the very best efforts of the folks in overseas buildings operations, those who sort of provide our secure facilities and make sure that we have what we need to do our jobs, there is the perception that we sometimes live and work in bunkers. And sadly, we are brought to that requirement in this day and age. And so anything that we can do to humanize us, to make us more accessible to our foreign interlocutors is a good thing. And sometimes it's art and sometimes it's other things. I mean, trying to get over this image that we are hunkered down behind walls is very important, and it's not easy. It's not easy.
You mentioned how we need to do more. We wish we could do more. We should be doing more. Adair did too. What do you think, is there a role or even a responsibility of other cultural organizations in the U.S. to be part of this overall effort?
I'm sure there is, and perhaps many of our guests here today would have views on that too. I mean, Michael talked about the difference between the performing arts and the visual arts, and obviously art in embassies has been, focused on visual arts, but there's great scope for a lot of work in the performing arts. But we know that that's an expensive proposition. Moving the, Alvin Ailey dance troupe around the world is an expensive proposition. And finding the resources to do that is a challenge for all of us, I know.
We haven't talked about the role of commercial culture or popular culture in cultural exchange and cultural diplomacy. Is there a role? Or are we more trying to balance out the huge role that it has by virtue of its ability to reach millions of people through the media?
Well, it's undeniable that it has a role. Whether it's always a positive one is the question, I suppose. But we know that American popular culture has tremendous influence around the world. And I don't think we should think of what we're talking about here today as a competition for that's bad and what we're talking about here is good. No. I mean, these are all ways in which America presents itself to the world. I think it's good to speak about what we're speaking about here in terms of this dialogue of cultures, and that our art is enriched by the experience of others. Clearly, we're a country that's enriched by the experience of others. We are a nation of immigrants. And popular culture doesn't work quite that way, or doesn't seem to work quite that way. I don't know. I'm sure others have views on that, but that's a challenge. That's a challenge.
Michael, can I get you to comment on this one?
Sure. I've lived several places abroad and worked several places abroad, and my experience was that many of the people who I worked with felt they got their American culture through the popular culture, through films, through rock music, through television shows. I can remember working in South Africa where every Tuesday night, every restaurant in Johannesburg had to close because Dallas was on television and no one went out, so that there was no reason to have a restaurant open on Tuesdays. And I believe that what we're trying to do in the not-for-profit arts is different from the for-profit arts. The for-profit arts are creating their work, and if it happens to get abroad and be sold, that's fine. But I feel like in the work we do in the not-for-profit arts in cultural exchanges, we have an actual motive for going abroad. We are trying to make an impression. We're trying to explain who we are as people. And I think it is different, and we have to be very careful, though, how we introduce ourselves as we go abroad, because we don't want to be perceived as saying to people, we think this is what is good and we want you to see it in a very didactic way. What we really are trying to say is, this is who we are, and we would like to explain who we are to you. And how we present ourselves abroad, I think, is absolutely essential if our art is going to be appreciated and if this exchange is going to be valuable.
And what makes it
There's an
more
arrogance.
absorbed?
The lack of arrogance, the lack of saying that this is what we consider good in America. But also, I find the tremendous role of exchange, of collaboration between American and international arts organizations is perhaps the most fruitful way of working, when you can work with an arts organization abroad and bring your art and your values and teach them while you're learning their art and their values and working together. you appear so much less arrogant than if you just come and say, here's what we do, we think this is great, you should too.
You
Yes,
mentioned
Charles.
you mentioned the word commerce a minute ago. I wonder when you're moving a big troupe of performers through a country, or when you're moving a very valuable painting, if maybe local art handlers, maybe local organizers, things like that, don't also benefit from learning about the way we do things.
Some of the greatest experiences I've had has been working with backstage crews in theaters around the world. I remember taking American Ballet Theater to Japan, and our languages are so different, but working together, we just had this remarkable collaboration, and I do think we influenced the way those people who worked backstage thought about us just because of the close proximity in which we worked for 7 days. Similarly, at the Kennedy Center now, we bring the Kirov Opera and Ballet now every year to the Kennedy Center, and most of their technical staff and crew speaks only Russian, and all of my staff does not speak Russian. And yet, as we've now been we're now in the 4th year of this relationship, and it's just remarkable to see year by year, we don't need translators anymore. You know, we did in the 1st year, we don't in the 4th year. We're building bridges between people who get to work together and now just work together in whatever way they do, what they do without translation. To me, this is really the best of cultural exchange because it's very, very meaningful and meaty and deep and not superficial.
You know, you're making me wonder, because I've heard this in other places, whether the whole idea of we export our culture and then maybe we'll invite other cultures to perform or show their art, whether that is a model that is passé, and whether the real cultural conversation of now and the future is actual collaboration and creating work together.
I think it is to some extent, but in the end, artists have to do what they think is their art, and you don't want to force an artist to collaborate simply because it's good. If an artist has a personal vision, that's the way they have to work. Where it does work to have a collaboration is when two artists or two arts organizations have some mutual ambition and a mutual vision. I don't think you want to force this. I think this has to come naturally.
Yeah. Thurman.
I was thinking that just the act of engaging and doing and however, whichever direction it goes, whether you're importing or exporting, is something to work from, and it's so personal per person. You know, I was also thinking about perception of how when you were talking about just how I'm perceived, you know, how I'm perceived as an artist, and I had to reevaluate that when I went to Mozambique, and I did about 8 other countries also, and one was an Islamic country, and how was I perceived, and how did I think of myself based on the information I was given here was totally different than what happened there, you know, and I found that the receptivity to whatever it is I'm interested in doing was very high, you know.
If I could ask you one point.
Yeah.
It was really funny for me in a way. I went to Baghdad last September to bring the Iraqi Symphony here. And in my first meeting with the heads of the symphony, I thought we were going to get into all sorts of cultural issues and whatever. And the only thing they were concerned was how much rehearsal time they'd have on the stage, which is the exact same thing that any American orchestra cares about, or any German orchestra cares about, or any Swedish orchestra cares about. You know, artists are artists, and we come sometimes with these expectations that some people are going to be so different from each other, and in the end, I find that most artists have the exact same concerns wherever they are, and that's one of the great learning experiences of exchange.
Thank you.
In
Charles.
the case of this exchange, what did they gain by coming here?
I think one important thing they gained was a world awareness, at least this country's awareness, that there is contemporary culture in Iraq, that we read so much about looted ancient artifacts, but there actually is a contemporary culture and contemporary wonderful artistic culture in Iraq. The orchestra itself gained the ability to make a case for its need for new music, new instruments, whatever, and left here with all new instruments and a new grand piano and a new music library. But most importantly, I think left with a collaboration that will continue, not just with our organization and our orchestra, but with others in the United States, where they are now collaborating, they're now performing more places, and they left with a sense that their organization has a life to it and has a reason for existing.
Yeah,
And,
thank you.
and it's a very potent thing.
It's really time for us to turn this conversation over to you. I did want to just provoke one other question, and then I'll hope that you will pick up on a lot of these threads about the roles and responsibilities of other organizations in exchange, state arts agencies included, the role and the influence of the commercial sector, and any of the other things that you'd like to talk about or pose. But I just realized that three of our panelists represent federal entities. And I'm wondering, and we've also talked about how important this is, and there's not enough of it going on. What is the role of other federal agencies? You know, what about the National Endowment for the Arts? What about the Library of Congress? What about the U.S. Department of Agriculture? When you're, you know, in relationship with the endowments, maybe you could address that a little bit, Adair.
Well, of course, I love seeing the arts integrated into all of it. Sometimes I think in this country we become so specialized that we break things out, and so they become separate. And so, you know, we were talking about this wonderful NEA program about homecoming, you know, the writing and people coming back from the war. I mean, whatever we do, it should be integrated. I don't see it as policy in the arts, and the arts are soft diplomacy. You know, Tony Garza said, that sounds dismissive. It's not soft diplomacy, it's effective diplomacy. I mean, I would love to see more of a cross-fertilization of these, you know, artists and the arts in everything, because it's part of being alive. It's not a separate part, it's part of being alive. And I keep coming back to the individual artists, because I do think in our country sometimes, when we're so rich and we have so many organizations, we have beautiful instruments and we have beautiful concert halls and all these things, that it's so easy, without wanting to just communicate superiority. And to have individual artists who are in Togo or in wherever they are, working on a human level, that the arts is a human response to the wonder of being alive and responding to whatever it is, the wind or the animals, or it's a human response to the wonder of being alive. And I think that's individual artists, and we can't lose that in the organizational part, which is wonderful, and we want all these things, and we want technical help for organizations, but we can't lose that key human connection, that it's not the United States, or I mean, we're all human beings. I got off the subject.
I hope that will inspire a number of questions and comments, and I'm expecting you to use the microphones and give us your expertise, and also ask any of the panelists any questions. Penny, you're going to have to go to the microphone, so we'll give people a little time to get there, but don't be afraid to line up so we can use our time well.
I'm Penny Ojeda, the International Coordinator at the Arts Endowment, and I can't pass up Ellen's cue there about other government agencies to say that our chairman, Dana Gioia, couldn't be here this afternoon, but I just want to communicate to all of you something that I've heard him say repeatedly in meetings and conversations. One of his biggest surprises when he came to Washington from California, where he was a well-known poet and nationally known, and previously had worked in New York, when he came to Washington, one of his biggest surprises was the very small level, the almost non-existent budget in the Arts Endowment, and generally in Washington, the low level of international exchange in the arts and culture. And while our budget at the Arts Endowment is modest but growing this year, we have a request that is $18 million higher for 2005. We are looking to expand and implement new international partnerships at the Arts Endowment. I think sometimes, having worked for many years at the endowment in this area now, I find that one of the biggest challenges is actually our own governmental, bureaucratic obstacles that we need to overcome and figure out how to work together more cooperatively. So I think at the Arts Endowment, anyway, there is a very positive attitude, very much an interest in engaging with the State Department, with other government agencies, and looking for ways to increase international exchange. And I know that our chairman would say that if he were here, and it's important that people know that the endowment, while our focus is domestic, we do support international exchange. For 2004. We have a program working in cooperation with the Open World Leadership Center to expand exchange with Russia. We're doing work with Mexico, and we're looking for creative ways to take resources and expand them to do expensive international work. That's what it comes down to. It is very costly. So we look forward to hearing more possibilities for cooperation.
Now, Penny, before I let you sit down, would you tell everybody a little bit about what's happening at States and at the grassroots, and maybe Jonathan Katz and Bob Lynch and some others of you who are working more broadly can describe that too, because we've talked about some very, very important initiatives that come from federal agencies and the private sector. But there's a lot going on, sometimes in not even an organized fashion. There's around the country.
A lot going on very organically, and I would say probably most of it's going on at the local level. There's a lot of international exchange among small community-based organizations. Much of it has to do with the more recent immigrations and people connecting back to their community of origin. The endowment worked for a number of years to encourage state arts agencies to do more international work. And though now a lot of state arts agencies' budgets are suffering great duress, there are a number of them that are still doing international work. Ohio is the champion. They've had an excellent international program for, I don't know, probably a good 12 years. They have actual cultural agreements between the state government and the city of Argentina. I think they have one with Chile. They've had them in the past with Japan. It's a very active international program in the state of Ohio. Other states have programs that are more targeted, and I don't know if Jonathan's here, he might be able to comment on that. And an exciting aspect of international work that has increased in the last few years is the sort of more official dialogue and engagement bodies that are convening around international issues. And there's an organization called the International Federation of Arts Councils and Culture Agencies, which are the sort of peer organizations to the National Endowment for the Arts that was founded about 3 years ago, I guess, and has had their second General Assembly in Singapore this past fall, and Jonathan attended that. It's a very good information exchange for national agencies to know what's going on in other parts of the world, other countries. They have an excellent online bulletin that comes out every couple of weeks called Acorns, which I encourage you to subscribe to if you're interested in this, because it's a good compendium.
Thanks.
And Bob can give you the lowdown on what locals are doing.
Bob Lynch?
One of the things that Americans for the Arts, or the thing that Americans for the Arts focuses on, is domestic. We're trying to get more resources for arts and arts education into American communities, so international is not the focus. However, along the way, what happens is that you see, and we have seen, the hunger and the interest in city after city all across America. And the point that I think, the main point is they tend to end up doing it independently, and they're looking for ways to do it more collaboratively, federal, state, local. And I think there's huge potential there. When I think that it hasn't been the focus, but even without it being the focus, there have been major collaborations with Northern Ireland, with Mexico, with Australia, with Israel, with China over the years, and that has been largely self-funded by the cities, although we had a terrific partnership with the National Endowment for the Arts for years through Americans for the Arts partnering on Northern Ireland issues, but largely self-funded and continuing. I think that there's a huge opportunity for a continuing and growing partnership and dollars from the local point of view to get this happening on a much wider scale. The cities also take part in things like Sister Cities programs and independent artist exchanges, and then the artists themselves tend to, and the arts administrators themselves tend to continue on their own. The last thing that I'd just say to Michael's point earlier is that the thing that Americans for the Arts has been asked the most about, and what we end up doing ourselves, is about arts administration. Arts administration information, largely about how the American arts system is funded, and there's great myths about how it's entirely privately funded and less reliant on earned income, and we have a lot of things that we can provide as help that way as well as learning on our own.
Thank you. Yes? Please say your name.
Yes, William Swetcharnik. I'm a visual artist, a painter. I wanted to mention a couple of other potential vehicles for engagement, and I'll just relate from my own experience. In the 1980s, I was a Fulbright Fellow in Spain, and as a result of that, the cultural attaché in Barcelona knew about my work and requested me to go down to Honduras in 1991 to, there used to be a program called Arts America, and I hope that some sort of equivalent of it will end up being revitalized. That was through the United States Information Agency, which has now become subsumed under the State Department. And among the things I was asked to do was to give a painting workshop at the National Art School. And about half the students didn't even have paints. And for about 30 years, I've been making a lot of my own art materials. I know a fair bit about the use of indigenous materials. And I ended up going back to Honduras in '95 with another Fulbright, actually. Stayed there 7 years. I went there to paint. The grant was only 9 months, actually, but I stayed on. I went there to paint and also to work with the art school, and I ended up working with schools all over the country who couldn't afford art materials. I showed them how to make their own, using indigenous practices that had to do with their own culture. And so this became a sort of reverse cultural exchange where I was encouraging artists, art students who in many cases were otherwise being so influenced by the American or European model to give more value to what comes out of their own culture. And so a lot of rich experiences came of that. And I started a program actually called the Latin American Art Resource Project with that in view. And as I said, I stayed there for 7 years, and I was tremendously enriched by it, and engagement took place on a really profound level, all through not only Honduras, all through Central America and the Caribbean as a result of that.
Thank you.
So I want to recommend the Fulbright as another avenue.
Yes, that's right. And a good example, yours is a good example as artist, as educator, and diplomat. Claire.
Thank you, Ellen. My name is Claire Franville. I'm with the Center for Arts and Culture, but I wanted to put on a different badge of affiliation, and that is of the private foundation sector, to keep that in mind as another important source, and maybe a quieter one than the federal or state, local governmental source of fostering international cultural exchange. While private foundations give approximately $3.5 billion in assistance and in support throughout this country, a fraction of that goes toward international arts exchanges. However, within some foundations that are also operating foundations, it is so interwoven in the fabric of their organizational activities across their sectors, speaking with greatest familiarity from the Getty, which was my former employer, with the Conservation Institute, the Research Institute, and the museum. international activity is such an important mission of each of those pillars of the Getty. For 5 years, it maintained silent and constant working relationships with China, for example, to develop the China Principles, which now guide all state-sponsored preservation and historic restoration. That's one example, but I just wanted to raise that as another important factor in this equation.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Very good point. Yes, sir.
Jesus Morales from Texas. I'm a granite sculptor. I just want to say from experience that I'm kind of in the world of sculpture appalled at how much that we don't do for other countries. I know I'm invited to different countries to work, and not just to go work over there, but actually to live with the people, and I just don't see it coming the other way. I think that we're such a rich country, and that we have the resources, and it's almost like I'm an ambassador, and the other people are ambassadors for their country. That why can't we bring people over here and do the same thing? They have, and we actually do work and leave work in these countries, and that represents us there forever. We're in northern China, 500 miles northeast of Beijing. World Sculpture Park just opened. They've been inviting people for the last 10 years from all over the world. Every country is represented there, and they fund this. They bring people in and supply all the materials and put them up, and then they end up with this huge undertaking. And they're doing this in every city. Every city in China is doing this, and India, and in Egypt. I've done it on the Aswan River, and so I just say I think that we should somehow organize something that goes the other way. I think that we kind of have a border coming this way. We need to open our borders in both directions.
Thank you. Does you want to
ask him
comment?
what he does, though, because tell him what you do, Jesus.
I have a cultural center outside of Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I feel like we're not doing enough, and I call it my back pocket foundation. But any time I have anything extra, we do, and it's primarily just for artists from other countries. So we've invited 18 Koreans to come over, and we had an exhibition. A Peruvian came and lived and worked in the studio for a year. Chinese had artists in residence programs. And I just finished an exhibition from Shandong province where it's called True Words, contemporary wood carvers from Shandong province. And it's called True Words because they're all deaf mutes. And so, you know, and we published a book that it's world premiered at my place and now traveling around to museums. And I know that if I can do it with no resources, I know that we can do it with a lot of resources. So I just think that we need to do more.
Thank you. Jesus, anybody else on the panel want to comment or respond? Yeah, Michael.
I, of course, agree that we could do more. I think one of the things that's different, though, is that in this country, the arts are so decentralized, whereas in so many other countries, particularly countries where the government is a key funding source, the artistic decisions and artistic projects are more centralized. I think there actually is a lot of art and artists coming to this country, but we just don't know about them because when one thing's happening in one city and one thing's happening in another city, and we have an awful lot of performing artists coming to the Kennedy Center, but that doesn't necessarily affect the whole country. It's just known here in Washington. So I think part of it has to do with the decentralized way we fund and work in the arts in this country.
Yes, sir.
My name is Willis Bing Davis from Dayton, Ohio. Professor Emeritus from Central State University at HBCU. Before making my comment, I'm moved to make a statement. Having served as Vice Chair of the Ohio Arts Council and a Democratic and Republican governor, having worked with National Endowment and Expansion Arts, having served as the Chair and past President of the National Conference of Artists, this is the most talented, inclusive gathering of artists I've ever had a chance to be with in my 42-year career. And I think it speaks to the fact that the program was looking at the quality of the work of the artists and not so much of their ethnic background and geographical region. But I've been inspired and almost ready to start my teaching career over again after today's session. But my comment is that I know, coming out of a pretty good academic school at DePaul University in Indiana and Miami University, I heard a lot about art. And what I found as I began my teaching career in 1960s, I knew a lot about Monet and Cézanne and Renoir and Picasso and Delacroix and Americas. I knew a lot about a lot of things, but I didn't know anything about me or those artists that represent my heritage. In looking at Maya, Inca, Australian Aboriginal, and then traditional African art, it changed my life and my work. And in 1966, I said I stopped teaching art and I began to teach people, because I found that the arts were reflective of the spiritual, cultural, and social values of people and was embodied in everybody's culture. And I think what this program has been doing, and I've only been familiar with it for a couple of years, is doing just that. And I would just like to commend the program and hope that it will continue. And maybe, following up my dear friend Jesus' recommendation, is that we look at some traditional ways to do what your goals and objectives are. The National Conference of Artists, a service organization of African American artists that began in 1959 with the leadership of E.J. Montgomery and Lois Mailou Jones and Margaret Burroughs, has had its third international conference just this past July of taking 61 artists to Ghana for 10 days to interface, which began in '85 in Dakar, Senegal, with 150 artists exchanging ideas and looking for ways to interface and bring knowledge back in exchange. I'm hoping we can find some of those organizations that may be smaller than the governmental agency that can assist in this tremendous goal and objectives. But I'm just tremendously moved by all the talent and all the people that are here, and hope that it will continue beyond. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, sir. And both you and Jesus raised something that I hope some others will address, Peggy Bulger, Barry Bergy, or some others of you, and that is specifically the power of traditional and folk arts, especially to reach Indigenous people, and what kind of exchange and collaboration we should be thinking about there. Ambassador Schneider.
Hi, Ellen. I'm Cynthia Schneider. I'm a professor at Georgetown University and was formerly the ambassador to the Netherlands. In fact, I'm thrilled to see two of my sculptures from my exhibition in this exhibition. I encourage all of you, when you go to the reception afterwards and see the Kiki Smith sculpture, which is actually a fountain, which was commissioned for my exhibition. And just imagine that fountain making its debut on my terrace on the day of the embassy Easter egg hunt, with all the little sub-4 and 5-year-olds scampering around this rather bizarre nude sculpture. But we all grew to love it. I want to speak from a couple of different perspectives. I'm an art historian by training. I was very privileged to be an ambassador in the last administration, and I've also worked in arts administration on the President's Committee. And I think there are a number of things that we could talk about which are not worth talking about, such as, why is there no more USIA? I mean, there isn't, so we're just going to have to deal with it. But that doesn't mean that you give up on culture. And there are a number of really excellent programs going on now. The Culture Connect program is one that I know Mr. Kaiser's been associated with, and I totally agree that the Art and Embassies program is an absolute banner program of what works. But my experience was that culture as part of the State Department is far too capricious. If it happened to be an interest of a particular ambassador, and it is an interest of many, many ambassadors, you don't have to be an art historian, many ambassadors are leader in this, then it would happen. But it's very hard to make much happen if it's not by happenstance the interest of that particular ambassador. My experience was there is a real lack of leadership and commitment from the State Department to the use of culture. Commitment is expressed in money, certainly, and that is still true. And I just think the words of "there is no money," they just fall a little hollow in light of the money that's being spent on other projects in other parts of the world. And I don't mean to be melodramatic, but I think that this kind of cultural outreach is truly part of our national security. And, think what would have happened if we had followed the advice of the curators and experts who went to the Pentagon with maps and said, these are the sites that must be preserved, and made that part of the strategic objective of taking Baghdad. Not, and I don't mean to say not the decision of a certain person at a certain place on a certain tank at a certain time, but part of the strategic planning. I obviously am not in the military, and I don't mean to imply these things are easy, but everything you do sends a huge message, and right now we are suffering so much, and we're paying for it every day in lives from the wrong messages that have been sent. And that would have sent the right message right away. But it would have required taking culture as seriously as other people take it. Other people take our culture very seriously. I mean, they love it, and they take it as a major part of America. Right now, the ambassador from Hungary is traveling the United States, having made a stop at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which I think is a fantastic thing for an ambassador to do. And he is giving a lecture, which he's given in the State Department, I'm happy to say, and the topic of his lecture is how rock and roll brought down the Iron Curtain. Now,
so subversive.
I don't know if an American were giving that lecture, if anybody would take it seriously. But, this is his personal experience, and he really means it. And so I wish that we, and when I say we, I mean the State Department, and this is a totally nonpartisan comment. It was under my administration that USIA was dismantled, so this is a nonpartisan thing. I wish that our government would take our culture as seriously as other people do. It is our #1 export. When I was ambassador, it was aerospace products. Now it's cultural products. And what an opportunity that is that we're missing. It is out there, like it or not. With the aerospace products, I can tell you, we spent a lot of time and money targeting those sales. And it was money and time well spent. It was worth it. What about giving some thought to actually strategically, placing, enhancing, distributing some of those commercial products and not let it go totally to the open market, which is the way it's done now? And because that is diplomacy, like it or not, it is.
With that provocative question, let me ask if any of the panelists want to comment or respond. No? All right.
Finally, let me just mention, the other thing is visas.
Quickly.
It's worth just mentioning visas, because we all know the impact of person-to-person exchanges and how incredibly positive that is, whether it's the Fulbright program or whatever program it is. That just pays rewards 100 times over, and the International Visitors Program, whatever it is. And the point just can't be made enough that the idea that we are protecting ourselves by shutting people out is not, I think, right.
Thank you. Thank you. Jonathan Katz.
My name is Jonathan Katz, and I direct the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. And that association was created by the state and territorial arts agencies of the United States, including Guam and the Northern Marianas and American Samoa, the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, to represent them and to be their clearinghouse as a learning community. And a challenge, a challenge in international cultural programming has to do with how difficult it is to learn what it takes And there are several skill sets involved, and one of them is to know and be able to do what it takes to take American art from here and share it with the world. And that's one set of skills and knowledge. And it's another set of skills and knowledge to take art from all over the world and bring it here and move it around. And it's another set of skills and knowledge to set up exchanges of art between governments and nations and states and cities. And it's another set of skills and knowledges to share our observations about cultural policy and about arts administration. And so as we have resources, we try to be a clearinghouse for those kinds of skills and knowledge. And I can mention a couple of things too. The states operate for touring purposes in regional groups. And the National Endowment for the Arts has fostered over the past 30 years regions that include all the states in the United States and the Pacific region as well. And that's where a lot of our touring expertise internationally resides, because it's something that governments can get together and do at an economy of scale. So a kind of thing that we did at one point was to work with the National Endowment for the Arts and convene state arts agency leaders, regional arts organization leaders, and other people in this room to talk about what it takes and what you need to know to foster cultural exchange. A couple of other things I'd mentioned going on, the International Federation of Arts Councils and Cultural Agencies that Penny mentioned, it's one of my goals to see that the state arts agencies interact with that international forum so that the knowledge that the world has about doing these kinds of things become the knowledge that the state arts agencies also have. And so that there's an exchange of those skills and expertise. There's an interesting initiative that the Michigan Cultural Council has with the Salzburg Seminar. And that has to do with identifying a vocabulary and a paradigm for how nations can talk amongst each other in a common vocabulary about culture, the establishment of organizations and networks, and about the expertise that administrators then get and about what artists then need to know, but a series of questions like that could be asked of any nation and any cultural system so that they can talk with a common vocabulary about cultural exchange and the place of arts in diplomacy. And finally, I'd mention that there are other coalitions in this room that I think it would be valuable for us to hear of. Co-Lead is one of them, which, Ellen, you've been involved in, and Harry Blaney is here, and Frank Hotzel, too. And I think that would be useful for us to hear about a little bit. And then perhaps even some of the things that the President's Committee has done with the Fox administration, like the workshop that you've facilitated at the very beginning of the Fox administration about arts administration.
Thanks for bringing that all up. May we go to this side, please?
Yes. Hello, my name is Marianne Pollock. I'm a visual artist. And just wanted to... I best express myself visually in visual art. I'm a painter, and my work was sent to, I actually left this country with $40 to my name because it was so, I was so discouraged trying to make a living as an artist full-time. So I had an intuition to go to Egypt, and I followed it. And it was very interesting. All kinds of doors opened, sort of just... Egyptians embraced me as an American artist. They wanted, as was said before, they were curious. I don't know how to express myself. It just was so tremendous. I felt so much love there. And so I was working, and when I came back, someone in the Arts and Embassies program heard I was over there, so blah, blah, blah. By the time I came back for a solo show the next year, 4 paintings were in the U.S. Embassy. So, in fact, as everyone else is saying, it did open doors for me in a very big way. So, over the course of 6 years, I had the honor to meet so many amazing people in the State Department, internationally. It's just a tremendous experience. But as the funding for U.S. aid diminished and doors started to close, and my intuition that something terrible was going to happen, because that's what happens when you close your heart. And the U.S. Embassy, by the way, in Egypt is the largest in the world, as most people know, and we have no arts and culture center. And there was no money, is what was told for me, and I had all kinds of projects proposed. And not to make it be a big wet rag, but I guess just what I'm saying is, in my heart and in my sketchbooks and files, I have lots of work that I'd love to do in the Middle East, and I speak a little bit of Arabic. And I feel very strongly, as the professor from Georgetown, I'm sorry I didn't catch, I just feel strongly as anybody who's here does. And I just wanted to say that if there are any doors open still, I'm very interested in going as an arts ambassador, and I do believe that art is the greatest promoter of peace that there is.
Thank you.
And the best bang for the buck, as they say.
Thank you.
I'm Nancy Matthews from Meridian International Center, and I would like to speak a little bit about those of us in the private nonprofit arena who are trying to be cultural ambassadors in our own way. Meridian has been working in the field of cultural diplomacy now for quite a long time. Not only do we have international visitors who come in many fields, including the arts, but we also have a very active exchange exhibition program. We have brought exhibitions here from Vietnam, Iran, South Africa, China, and a number of other countries. The purpose of these exhibitions is the promotion of international understanding, which is exactly what we're talking about today. We have also sent American exhibitions abroad, and I can't tell you the hunger there is for this kind of thing abroad. We sent one all through East Asia, just at the time of the millennium. But most recently, we sent something called True Colors abroad. It was organized just after 9/11, and it has 78 artists participating, many of them very well known, and it's traveled to Turkey, to Germany, Northern Ireland, Albania, Slovakia. It just opened in Slovakia a few weeks ago, and I can't tell you the impact that this exhibition has had wherever it's gone. But what I'd like to say is that we who are working in the nonprofit area have one huge challenge, and that's funding. These exhibitions are very, very expensive, and we have to really sell it to corporations to underwrite it and foundations. But it is not easy because the competition today for corporations to give away their money makes it extremely difficult to get it for the arts. You have to be a real salesman. So I'm just saying this is one of the challenges I think we all face, that all that we may want to do is possible only if we have the funding. Thanks.
Thank you, Nancy. Barry?
I'm Barry Burgee, and I direct the Folk and Traditional Arts program at the National Endowment for the Arts. I wanted to say that I had the privilege of taking a bluegrass band and a western swing band on a USIA tour in 1981 throughout North Africa and the Middle East, and I saw the real value of that program and artists meeting on a grassroots level, both to exchange ideas and, of course, musical licks as well. Next week, on Saturday, I'm going back to my hometown in Missouri to see the bicentennial of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And it strikes me that that probably was the first government-funded arts touring program, because Lewis and Clark took along musicians, and there often was an exchange of music and of goods, of handicrafts along the way, as a way of people getting to know one another. And this brings to mind the idea that there is always reciprocity involved in artistic exchange and artistic outreach. And I wondered whether any of our embassies had a program that involved collecting and exhibiting indigenous work from those host countries, because I think hanging that work side by side with American artists sends a powerful message. I think sometimes we think we're only presenting ourselves, but this idea of working with the local artists is also a very powerful one, and having that kind of exchange.
Yeah, great question. Carl or Ann Johnson, do you want to
I will just say, from my narrow perspective, that does occur. That's not necessarily centrally organized, but missions around the world do try and promote local artists as well and display them alongside American artists, and we did so in Togo, and I'm sure there are other places that do it as well. I don't know, Anne, if you have any.
Director of the Arts and Embassies Program.
The Art and Embassies Program, of course, is a loan program, but we also are in the overseas building operations, and we started curating a little bit, helping them. When a new embassy is built, there is a percentage that is given for the purchase of art. And they've been using outside consultants for that, and they've started using us, and so I know a little bit about it. But we have just done Istanbul, just an absolutely beautiful building and a wonderful art collection, a lot of wonderful American art. But a part of that budget has to be spent on local art from people native to the country. So I think that's a wonderful part of the State Department, a wonderful policy. And I probably shouldn't tell you that we're now buying a little art because we just really want you to lend to us, but we're really, that's really part of the interior furnishings. And they are more into interior design. Our program is all about diplomacy and making friends and sharing what we all know that we have in common. But the U.S. government does do that. And also I wanted to say, I know there was some huge concern. Originally, our curators were all upset, and we were trying to help when the Iraqi museum was raided. But I have heard good things that a lot of that has been recovered. So, and I think a lot of the nonprofit groups in the States have been instrumental in that, that project.
Thank you, Anne. Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Armando Arismendi, and I'm from Austin, Texas. I'm not an artist. I'm here escorting my wife, who is an artist, Connie, in the Art in the Embassies program. The reason I'm here talking today is because I'm also on the Secretary of the Board of Directors at Mexicarte Museum in Austin, Texas. And one of the recent accomplishments that we had was to sign an agreement with Conaculta in Mexico to bring permanent collection art from Mexico into our museum in Austin. And so why is this important? The reason it's important is because it's bringing the richness of the culture of Mexico into Texas, into the United States. For me, there's two parts to this. One is that in Austin, particularly, the Mexican and Mexican-American community is particularly isolated from where they came from, which is Mexico. And so this is an attempt to bring the richness of their culture, of our culture, to Austin and to Texas. I mean, because for the most part, what you see in TV is a very negative perception, a negative view of what our culture is in general. The other part is to educate the non-Hispanic community as to what Mexican art really is. There's also a stereotypical view of what that is, and we're trying to change that. At least that's one of my passions, is to not only educate the Hispanic community in Austin and in Texas, but also to bring the richness of the Mexican heritage, the Mexican culture and art to the United States. And so that's what we're trying to do. And I would challenge that everybody in here to continue to pull that kind of culture, whether it's Mexican or African or Chinese, wherever, to pull that into the United States, because we are we're a pretty isolated country here, and we really need to become more diversified in that respect. And if it doesn't come from us, then who will do that? And that's why I'm committed to doing that, in particular from the Mexican culture perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Harry Blaney.
Thank you, Ellen. My name was used in vain by Jonathan, so I want to do a announcement, if you would, or a plea, really, more than anything else. COLEAD, the Coalition for American Leadership Abroad, is a group of about 53 foreign affairs NGOs, and we've been working with the other person's name who was brought in vain, Frank Hodsall at the Center for the Arts and Culture, and yourself, Ellen, in your earlier hat, to try to broaden and strengthen American culture and art in the international exchange field. And we are still working hard on this. And the plea, and by the way, Kenton Keith is over there as well, who gave me the idea to work and labor in this area from Meridian International. I would like to say that each, really in the hands of each of you here, particularly those of you who are living outside of Washington, D.C. in the grassroots, you can actually have a hand in help in the process, because one of the common themes throughout this discussion at every level, whether private in the city or the state or the national level, is the problem of funding, which has decreased and has been cut, destroyed in many cases unnecessarily over the years, that there is a need to express your voice. I would like to urge you that on the local level, and with your congresspersons and senators and your cities and your mayors, to talk about all the things that you've talked about today and the value of that to all of us and to our country, particularly at this particular time of crisis and difficulty. And it is your voice, if you would, on the Hill with the administration and with your fellow citizens and groups, both in terms of about the need for the resources that are behind this, but also the resources you have in your own hands locally in the private sector and the foundations and corporations and all the rest. We need a larger and bigger voice, so I ask you to join all of us when you go back, not only here, because it is factually, it is in our hands here as citizens to try to fight and struggle and make that voice clear and to find the resources and let others who are maybe, pressured by other forces, if your forces are not there, people will not pay attention, will not understand that process. So I'd like to urge you all to think about ways you can cooperate with other members of the arts and cultural community, and I might add with the foreign affairs community, in trying to make our international cultural programs stronger and better. Thank you.
Thank you. Peggy Bulger.
Hi, I'm Peggy Bulger, and I'm director of the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress. And I want to echo my colleague Barry Burgess' remarks about the give and take that happens, especially at the grassroots level, especially at the level that perhaps gets forgotten even by the arts community. Ironically, after many, many years of working in arts organizations, 5 years ago I found myself in a library. And never having realized how tragic it is that we don't really break out of our little arts community to look at arts and culture, which is something that the Center for Arts and Culture is really trying to do, is to look at the whole aggregate and the process of creativity and get the humanities, the arts, the historic preservation, and folk life to work together. So I've been very privileged to work with Ellen and her staff when she was at the Arts and Culture Center on looking at culture in the big picture. And just the comments about Egypt is very interesting. Just recently, the Library of Congress has a program called Global Gateways, which is a same kind of project in many ways as Arts and Embassies, but it's working with libraries across the world to do online exchanges, digitize materials, make sure that they're there forever. And we're working with the National Library of Egypt right now out of Cairo. And they had wanted to bring the techie people, and they wanted to bring, the folks who are Middle East experts, but they called back and they said, bring the folklorist. And I thought, what? And it turns out the National Library of Egypt is very interested right now in recognizing the fact that their arts at the grassroots level are extremely endangered right now. If nothing else, they need to document it. And I just went to see the Quilts of Gee's Bend exhibit when it was up here, and I thought it would make a wonderful exchange. I'm saying this to the Arts and Embassies people and anybody who might be working with exchanges. Be a great exchange to go to the Street of Tent Makers in Cairo, where men are making the most intricate quilts I've ever seen in my life, and it's, this is like passed down from generation to generation. Have an exchange with the quilting, and I didn't realize that our embassy in Cairo is the largest overseas, so maybe I'll give them a call. Anyway.
Thank you. Yes.
Yes. My name is Kathleen Walsh. I have a solo exhibit in the embassy in Quito, Ecuador. And I was invited last year, especially by Ambassador Christy Kenny, to come and work with Ecuadorian artists. And along the lines of grassroots compatibility, I said I would agree to anything, as I was so amazed to be invited. And one of the things that happened was the artists that I worked with were very interested in knowing, what did I see in Ecuador through my eyes as an artist? What could I tell them about what I was seeing? And I couldn't really paint while I was there. I'm a painter, because I was overwhelmed. But I did write. And we kept a copy of the quotes. And Ambassador Kenny later asked if she could reproduce my paintings into a calendar. And I had never really thought of them being in a calendar. But I agreed. And they were interspersed with these quotes about what did I see in the little villages that I worked in. And she just recently sent me an email about this calendar, which I think now is covering most of the country. She writes, I just received a letter from an Indian woman to whom I gave a copy of your calendar. She said she was reading aloud to her children the various quotes so they could appreciate art in their country and the ability to see beauty in their daily life. Surely that's testimonial enough to keep the program growing.
Thank you. Eloquent testimony. Sir.
Hi, my name is Richard Dana.
I'm sorry, and just before you start, I regret to say we have about 6 minutes left. So
I'm going to be brief.
If the remaining speakers would speak briefly. Thank you.
My name is Richard Dana. I'm an artist based here in Washington. I've shown a fair amount internationally. I've also been involved with a number of cultural exchange programs with artists from other countries. And one thing I'm always struck by when I'm in other countries is the intrinsic value that other cultures place on the role of the artist in society. And I say this by way of contrast to the United States, where I think there may be more of a tendency for Americans to look at the value of someone just by the amount of money they make, present company accepted, I assume, in terms of that view. And I mention this just by way of saying that the United States certainly projects itself as the most powerful military force in the world and an economic juggernaut, but it does become a question of what perception we want to have other people take of the United States. And I think one where, to balance that other perception, that this is a country that really appreciates its culture and is proud of it, would be a very positive thing, and perhaps the value of culture in other societies is underestimated by the U.S. government, perhaps even the State Department, other than arts and embassies. And I think the more culture we can promote, the better. And I would agree with Michael Kaiser that I believe it has to be in a sustained fashion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Bill Gilcher and Andrew Solomon. I'm going to, as the essayist for the very fine book, I'm going to give you the final wrap-up set of comments. Bill.
I'm Bill Gilcher. I'm an American working for the Goethe Institute, German Cultural Centers in the United States, here in Washington, one of 7, and around the world around 130 or so. I've been thinking about these issues for some time. It seems to me that it's a no-brainer why the State Department should be actively engaging, looking for artists to speak to the issues of our time. These are, after all, the world's expressive people. These are the people who think, who feel for all of us who are less articulate, who speak for the millions and millions of people and for their feelings and for their thoughts. So we desperately need to harness the energy of these people and to get them to address the serious, horrible issues that are facing us as a people and the peoples of the world in general.
the role of the arts in a time of war and of terror, and the role of artists, of arts organizations, is something which is just absolutely, desperately pressing. And it just doesn't strike me that we're doing anywhere near enough. Artists fear to be instrumentalized, to be used for political purposes. Let's ask the artists to speak to these issues. Let's listen to them, not just our own artists, but artists around the world. And I think we'll have something to listen to, and we'll have something to think about for a long time afterwards. So that's all.
Andrew.
I'm Andrew Solomon, and I'm a writer, and have written on cultural diplomacy before. In the early 1990s, I was in Kazakhstan, and I had gone out into the steppe in Kazakhstan to talk to some of the people there about their perceptions of the West. It was at a time when there was really a grappling going on among spheres of influence over that extremely large country with extremely large oil reserves and nuclear weapons. And when I talked to a group of people in a yurt one day, they said to me, you know, when the Iron Curtain fell and the Soviet Union ended, our instinct was to head toward the United States. That had always been the place that we fantasized about. He said, but they had seen of the United States exactly three things. They had seen Dallas, they had seen Baywatch, and they had seen Dynasty. And he said, having seen those things, he said, our feeling is that America is not moral and that it is not serious. And we therefore feel now that our engagement should be with Iran, which was one of the other countries attempting to exert influence. Now, this was a small group of people in a particular yurt, and I don't by any means wish to suggest that our popular culture should be held back from other countries, only that it should be balanced with that higher culture, which I think communicates to people the American ideals that we're so eager to export to the rest of the world. And particularly at a moment when we're confronting terrorists and talking about a war against other principles of government, it's a war of ideas, and a war of ideas can be won only by the compelling and direct address to those ideas. And I think it's through the cultural sphere that ideas are most vividly expressed, and that other cultures have the best opportunity to engage with them and to recognize the splendor of them, which is not to say that the work should be propagandist or should narrate a specific and particular version of America, simply that it should reflect the diversity, the complexity, and the profundity of America, and the nature of the freedoms that are so essential to this country.
Well, Andrew, thank you for your excellent summary. That means that all I have left to do is to congratulate the State Department and the Arts and Embassies program and all of you on the 40th anniversary of this flagship program. Thank you, Anne, and your fine curatorial and administrative staff for all that you do.
I'm sorry I cannot let that go unanswered. Ellen and her staff in the Center for Arts and Culture have been a great partner for this. It could not have happened without them. They're the experts in this. We do the art. So thank you very, very much, Ellen, for your expertise and your time and all of your support. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you. And I want to thank each member of the panel for your insight and your willingness to share your expertise and engage in my questions and share your personal experiences and testimonies. It was all very, very valuable. And finally, I want to thank each of you. You enriched this conversation greatly. I hope that the Center for Arts and Culture and the Department of State can find a way to continue this conversation. And now I ask you to applaud yourselves.